Thank you everybody for coming along today to this seminar in a series which is co-sponsored by the Education and Employers Taskforce and the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. This is a real collaboration today because we have a speaker from the Commission itself. Somebody who's perhaps, is one of those people who behind the scenes is responsible for huge amounts of really interesting work on the whole field of employer engagement in education and how young people's experiences develop in light of their workplace exposure. And so it's a particular pleasure today to be able to introduce David Massey, who will be talking for the next 25 minutes or so about a structural change in the lives of young people, which is of pretty profound significance. So David, I'll hand it to you.
Well, thanks Anthony, and good morning everyone. So, as Anthony says, I'm going to talk you through our report, The Death of the Saturday Job, or the declining earning and learning amongst young people in the UK. So this is what I'm going to go through over the next 20-25 minutes or so. So what is the death of the Saturday job? Why is it important? How and for whom is it happening? And most importantly, why is it happening? So first of all, then, what do we mean by the death of the Saturday job? So for the context of this report, we're basically talking about young people who are aged between 16 and 24, who are in full-time education, but have got a part-time job of some kind. So we're excluding apprenticeships. And that's where the term Saturday jobs comes from. It's often, people working in retail, hospitality on the weekend, but it can include a whole range of things. So that's what we're talking about, young people in full-time education who've also got a part-time job. And this is what we did in the report. So we spotted the death of the Saturday job a couple of years ago in a report we did called the Youth Employment Challenge, which we did about 2012. We thought, this is really interesting. And we tried to talk to people about it, and the first question they asked is, well, why is this happening? To which our response is, well, we don't know. So eventually got around to commissioning some research to figure out what's actually going on. And this is broadly what we did. We did some very detailed work on some OECD international data and very detailed work on the UK labour market using the labour force survey. To dig underneath that a little bit more, we did an online survey through YouGov of 1,000 young people, this time with just 16 to 21 year olds, because we reasoned that when you get 22 plus, you're getting a lot of people basically postgraduate education. It's a very specific group. We wanted to make sure we got as many of the teenagers in the sample as we could. And then to build on that, we did some focus groups to try and unpick what some of the issues were in the data. And that was with young people, educational institutions and some employers as well. So this is the death of the Saturday job in one slide, really. So what we've got here is the share of young people, the dark blue line, 16 to 17-year-old students who've also got a job, and the grey line is the 18 to 24-year-old students who've also got a job. And what we can see, this chart goes back about 20 years or so, and we see the kind of this long-term decline, especially in the 16 to 17-year-old age group, where at the end of the 90s is almost half of 16 to 17-year-olds had a part-time job of some kind, and now it's less than 20%. For the 18 to 24-year-olds, the decline is a lot less. Some of it is clearly due to the onset of recession in 2008, but it did definitely start before then, in around about 2006. Okay, so when we talk about the death of the Saturday job, there are other issues around it as well. So it's not just this binary distinction between young people who've got a job and those who haven't. Their attachment to the labour market has changed as well. So what we know, so for those young people who in education who do have a job, we see a decrease in their detachment, and that there's more temporary contracts, more zero-hour contracts, and also a kind of very small decline, but a significant decline in the number of hours that people are actually working. And this is shown graphically. So again, the dark blue line is the 16 to 17-year-olds, and you can see it was fairly flat. This is temporary jobs, the share of young people who've got a temporary job, and then it started to increase, and that's a fairly recent change. And then, interesting for the 18 to 24-year-old group, for the last sort of 20 years, it was on the decline, temporary jobs, and then it started to go up again with the onset of recession. So it's not just declining earning and learning; it's the nature of the work and the nature of attachment to the labour market itself. And again, shows the same thing, but this is an even more recent change. These grey bars, you can see at the end there, the growth in 0 hours contracts. So it's gone from it's still relatively low numbers, but it's gone from like 2-4% up to 12 to 14%. So it's quite a large change. And we've looked at the whole issue. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail about 0 hours contracts and things like this now. We have done some research on this before, and we found quite mixed evidence. So it's clear that for some people, young people included, 0 hours contracts work quite well. They give them a lot of flexibility. They can dictate which hours they work. But for other people, they have the opposite position. It can be quite restrictive, and it's very difficult to plan study around things like that. Okay, so this is what it looks like internationally. And basically, on the left-hand side here, you've got the share of 15 to 19-year-olds who are students, and they've also got a job in the year 2000. And on the right-hand side, it's 12 years later. And this is the UK here, so we're kind of near the top end. We're above the OECD average. We're up there with countries like Denmark and Australia and Netherlands and Switzerland, lots of whom are countries which have quite good apprenticeship systems, and that's the red bits of these bars. The blue bits are just other jobs. But then over the 10 years or so, we've slid down the rankings, and we've come down to, we're still above the OECD average, but we've come down quite a lot. Whereas these other countries, Netherlands, Australia in particular, they've got pretty much the same figures. The only other country where there's been a similar decline is the United States, and they've moved from, so they were slightly below us before, and I think they're still slightly below us now, so they're just over there. But those are the only two countries which have seen this decline, which is quite interesting in and of itself. So just to summarise where we've got it to so far before I go on. Basically, we've got a long-term decline in earning and learning. We've also got decreasing attachment to the labour market, and this decline is not really seen in other countries. But why? Why does this matter? Why is this important? What's interesting about this? And there's lots of reasons, really. This is a table taken from a piece of research that the Department for Education did a few years ago. We found the death of the Saturday job almost by accident. One of the things we think is quite interesting about it is it's completely counterintuitive. Most people, if you have a conversation with them, presume that students more and more have part-time jobs. It's just what everyone does. In fact, when we first started looking at death of the Saturday job, we were looking for evidence of the exact opposite. We were looking to see, well, obviously because everyone's got a job now and they're studying, perhaps there needs to be something about the way in which education works needs to fit around that, or to change or respond to that. But obviously we found the complete opposite. We thought, oh, that's interesting. And then at the same time, the Department for Education did this research. They managed a study, or they used to manage a study, which is a longitudinal study, which tracked about 15,000 young people from the ages of about 13 or 14, and I think they're doing the final survey this year with them now that they're 25, and track them all the way through. And this is one of the tables which came out of that research, and it's a transition matrix. It shows, so this is what young people are doing in terms of education when they're at 17 or 18, and this is what they're doing a couple of years later. And so what you can see is that they've got people in full-time education, people in full-time education and work, and those with bits of job or training as well, different statuses. And what they're doing a couple of years later. So one of the things which stands out from this is that, so for those who are in full-time education only, a year later, at 17 or 18, 41% of them are in university. But for those who've got a job as well, it's 47%, which is higher, which is quite interesting. And then when you look at the NEET figures, those in full-time or education only, 15% of them were NEET, compared to just 4% for those in education and work. Now, obviously, that's just a simple transition matrix. It doesn't take account of the various factors involved, but this same research did do an awful lot of regression analysis as well, that controlled for educational attainment, gender, ethnicity, region, parental background, a whole range of things. And they found that overall, if you're working and learning at the same time, your chances of becoming NEET is reduced by between 4 and 6 percentage points. And those impacts last quite a long time. You can still find an impact up to 5 years later. It also found that those who had a job and combined with their studies were earning 12 to 15% more 15 years later. And again, just to clarify, that's controlling for a whole range of different factors. More recent international evidence from the OECD finds an impact on generic skills such as self-organising and influencing. So for those of you who are familiar with the PIAC study into adult skills, this some of the follow-up research on that looked at the relationship between various factors and found that those who had a part-time job had got better at these organising and influencing skills. Also, I think some BIS research later on found that there's a potential impact on literacy and numeracy skills. So again, as we all know from the PIAC study, 16 to 24-year-olds didn't do well compared internationally. But when you look at that study year by year, as the age group goes on, there's a sort of spike up in the early 20s as people sort of catch up. And one of the things that they posit in this research is that perhaps it's the impact of the workplace itself which improves literacy and numeracy. So that's all quite initial. And on the fourth point there is better prospects for graduates. So a separate study called Future Track, which tracked graduates for several years, followed graduates who'd had various conditions, whether they had a part-time or not, and found that graduates with part-time jobs while they're studying got better degrees, were more likely to get a graduate job, earn more, and were less likely to be unemployed. And all of this makes complete sense if you bear in mind UK Commission evidence, which when we ask employers about what they think about when they're recruiting, and also what they think about young people that they've recruited directly from education, and our surveys are always very, very robust, but always far more positive than what you read more generally about young people's preparedness for work. The one factor which does keep coming up is experience. If you ask employers what they think of young people and how well prepared for work, on the whole they think actually, no, yeah, they are quite well prepared for work. But if there is an issue, it's down to lack of experience, and the death of the Saturday job might be part of that. You won't be able to read this, but these are just some of the sources for those pieces of evidence for those that are interested. Okay, so that's why this is important. I'm now going to go into some of the features of the decline and who it affects. So first of all, this is just a simple split by gender. The dotted lines on this chart are male and female 18 to 24-year-olds, and the solid lines are the male and female 16 to 17-year-olds. And what we see is that the decline seems to have affected all groups in the same way. The gap between the 16 and 17-year-old male and female, so the females are significantly more likely to have a job than the males, but that gap has been pretty consistent over the last sort of 20 years or so. And I'd argue with London Economics, who did the research, that this gap was sort of widening for the older group, but they said the differences weren't statistically significant, but I'm here to say that, so they're not saying. But so, I mean, even if it is, it's a very small change, but so broadly the point is that the decline doesn't seem to have affected any group in terms of gender over another, but it does highlight these big gaps, but they've been there for a while. And again, this is another interesting dimension. This looks at how it's changed for people depending on their parental backgrounds. So this is the level of parents' education. So whether your parents got a degree or equivalent, A-level or equivalent GCSE, or below level 2, or no qualifications. And again, what's interesting is that the decline, it's affected all groups equally, but this gap here, where for those whose parents are educated below level 2 or got no qualifications, is a significant gap, but it's been there for quite a long time, so it hasn't affected that group in particular. Again, by ethnicity, some huge variations there, but again, the decline seems to have affected each group individually, but it does highlight some particularly interesting gaps. So these are the dark blue bars are for white young people, white students, and they're up to 4 times more likely to have a job than Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or other groups as well, in terms of having a job. And this holds pretty much for the 18 to 24-year-olds as well. We didn't go into so much detail as to why this might be the case. We do have a bit more evidence for on this, which is in the report, but it's kind of at the back, if anyone's got a question about it later on. So yeah, this shows the same thing for 18 to 24-year-olds. The gaps are narrower, but broadly the decline has affected all groups fairly equally. And so this is again the same thing by geography. So the light blue bars was earning and learning in 2002, and the dark blue bars for I think for 2014. And again, we've seen it's declined in every region, but for more than some regions more than others. I mean, the biggest declines have been in the northwest of England, the southwest, the southeast, and Scotland, but they all had different starting points. And I think when you get into the geography, you get into some of the more interesting issues, because the geography, a lot of it is dictated by the nature of the jobs available in those local labour markets. So in the southwest, for example, there's a ton of hospitality jobs, lots of tourism jobs. These are jobs which are quite friendly to young people who are starting out their careers. Okay. So before I move on, so we can see that the declining earning and learning has happened for a whole range of different groups, whole different job types, but it doesn't seem to have affected any group in particular. Over others, it's this kind of steady decline which seems to affect everyone equally. So what's caused this decline in earning and learning? So we've basically found 3 reasons. First one is to do with young people themselves and their attitudes. Young people are quite simply just choosing to concentrate on their studies. The second point is a changing labour market. It's to do with access to those sorts of jobs, and I'll explain that a bit more in a second. And the third one is the difficulties in timetabling work and study. And these 3 reasons are in pretty much order of priority. We think the first one is the most important, then the second one, and then the third one is probably only a minor effect, but it's important to note. But the other thing I'd like to say is that it's really hard to disentangle these 3 causes. We don't know if young people's attitudes to study are changing because the labour market is changing. And equally, you could argue that the labour market is changing because young people's attitudes are changing. For example, if young people just don't want to do those kind of jobs anymore, it might be that one of the reasons for them drying up. So it's quite difficult to disentangle, but nevertheless, we'll do our best. So we did our survey of 1,000 young people and asked them, those who weren't earning and learning, why this was the case. This pie chart is a breakdown of all the responses to the survey, so not necessarily the individuals. We allow people to have numerous responses, but the figures in brackets here are the actual share of individuals. So I'll just go through some of the biggest causes there. So this dark blue bar is just preferences relating to studies. So this is young people just saying, look, I want to focus on my studies. I don't want to have a job. That was accounted for 23% of all responses, but about 3/4 of all young people cited that as a reason. And this sort of orange bar here, this is the local labour market stuff. And again, it was over 1/3 of young people, over 1/3 of responses related to the local labour market in some way, and there were lots of things within that. It could be the jobs are all full-time and I need part-time, it could be that the pay isn't good enough, it could be that the skills mixed wasn't quite right. There's a whole range of local labour market conditions. But again, over half of all young people who weren't earning and learning cited that as a reason. And then sort of the next reasons are around inflexible education providers and financial issues. And that's young people saying, I don't need to work, I've gotten it from grants and loans or help from parents, things like that. And as you can see, those two groups are quite smaller. So this is just taking everyone's responses and putting them all in one big chunk and saying, what does it look like? We also asked, what is your main reason? Out of all those reasons, what's your main reason? As you can see, the pattern changes quite a lot. So now we get to the point where over half are saying, look, it's about my studies. I just really want to focus on my studies. And by comparison, those citing the local labour market conditions drops quite significantly. So now it's less than 1 in 5. And all the other barriers drop by the wayside. So this isn't to say that those other reasons aren't as important. We think they are really, really very important. But the impact on the attitudes towards studies is obviously the driving force. And this is backed up by the labour force survey data as well, so these lilac bars, these are young people who are earning and learning, and as I said before, so it's around about 40% in the late 90s down to under 20% 2014. But these orange bars, these are young people who are in full-time education, they're not seeking work, they're not looking for work, they don't want to work, and that's obviously been growing. But nevertheless, in between, you've got this sort of intermediate group of people who are either unemployed, as in they're actively seeking work and looking for work and they're available for it and studying, or these are the groups who might not be looking right now, but they would like to work. So they're quite a consistent and significant group throughout. And it's likely that these groups are the ones that are talking about the local labour market conditions that are holding them back, whereas the orange bars is down to the people that are just saying, look, I just want to focus on studies. So what is this issue with the local labour market, and what's going on with the economy more generally? So on here we've got, this is the number of part-time jobs in retail and hospitality. So this is a huge part of the labour market for young people. I think it accounts for something like 2/3 or even 3/4 of all jobs for young people. So what happens to those jobs is obviously really, really important. This line shows what's happened to the numbers of those jobs since 1996. And as you can see, it's fairly sort of flat. It's hovered around 2.5 million. But then if you put on top of that the numbers in full-time education, it's gone significantly from a little over 2 million to a little over 3 million. So straight away that's telling us that the labour market for those sorts of jobs in particular is very, very competitive. And this shows the same thing again, but adding on all part-time jobs. So this chart is indexed, so it's just a way of comparing 3 different sets of data. So that's what's going on with part-time jobs. So we've had a kind of almost 20% increase in the number of total part-time jobs. That's the numbers of people in full-time education, and that's the numbers of people in retail and hospitality. So it's fairly flat. And so while we have had lots of growth in part-time jobs, and there's a narrative about the labour market becoming more flexible and more part-time jobs, and that's all true. The fact is, the growth in the part-time jobs, a lot of it has been jobs which aren't really available or accessible to young people, especially while they're in education. Okay, so moving on to the final point then, which is about the difficulties timetabling work and study. So in the focus group research we found, and I have to emphasise it, in the focus group research it was quite anecdotal, it's very qualitative, and we spoke to I think about 10 different providers. We found really mixed approaches amongst education providers to how they dealt with the issue of earning and learning. We found some education providers were saying things like, we have rules against this, we don't actually encourage it, we timetable so that it becomes more difficult. Equally, I had other providers saying, we really encourage this. We really encourage learners to reflect on what they've learned in their work time, in their part-time work, and see how it impacts on their studies. And organise those sorts of providers were organising catch-up sessions for their students. So a real kind of mixed bag of issues there. And that probably reflects why it's only 9% of learners in our survey that said that the main reason they didn't combine work with learning was because it was just education provision was just too inflexible. So it is an issue, but it's nowhere near as big as or important as the changes to the labour market and young people's attitudes themselves. Okay then. So this is the final slide now. So just to summarise what I've been through so far. So we've seen a significant decline in earning and learning amongst young people. The decline hasn't affected any particular groups, although it does highlight that there are massive variations within groups, but those variations have been around for a long time and haven't really changed that much. The reasons for this are a mixture between preferences, changes to local labour market conditions, and the difficulties of timetabling work and study. And these trends are really important due to the wealth of benefits. I mean, the benefits that you get from earning and learning are really, really quite significant and really quite substantial. So it's, I think it's quite an important issue. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.